My name is Jess. I am a doctoral student at the University of Memphis in guitar, and I'm also the lecturer of guitar at Mississippi State University. Really excited to be here and really thrilled that you were able to come to this. Going to talk a little bit about a composer and a piece of music that means a great deal to me. This is the piece Sarabande in Profane style for solo guitar by American composer Libby Larsen. I'll start the presentation with just doing some talking, a little bit of playing, then I will be playing the piece in full, and then wrapping up with a few comments and questions. So a little bit of background information on Larsen. She was born in 1950 in Delaware, although she spent most of her life and still resides in Minnesota. Her compositional output, on her website it says 500, but it's probably more towards 600 now. 600 works, which is a really, really large canon of like very, very diverse, just very diverse canon. She has solo works, vocal works, small chamber works, larger works for orchestra and choir, as well as opera. She has many accolades, just to name a few. She founded the Minnesota Composers Forum in 1973, which is now, you might have heard of the American Composers Forum, and she's also a Grammy Award winner. So guitar music and why it's important. Hopefully some of you have at least heard of Libby Larsen's name. She's sort of a big name in classical composition, but not necessarily, I think, known for her guitar music. So guitar performance and composition has historically been dominated by men, which is fine, but I think my goal here is to elevate Larsen's music to sort of empower women and other minorities to love and play and study the guitar. Her repertoire, even just in her guitar canon, is very interesting and very diverse. She has written for classical guitar, which you will hear today, but as well as electric guitar. She has solo works, it's like something you'd hear today, but also small chamber pieces like guitar and flute, or guitar and voice. But she also has these really interesting instrumentations such as like electric guitar and choir or electrified harpsichord. So she's very inventive, and I think she writes in an like pushing the boundaries way, but also an inclusive style when it comes to guitar. So, but today, just for the sake of time, I'll be focusing on one piece, the Sarabande in Profane style. So just a bit of background on this piece. It was published in 1996. It was written for and dedicated to John Holmquist, who passed just a few years ago. He studied at the University of Minnesota under Jeffrey Van, who's also a famous guitarist, and she worked with Jeffrey, and they worked together with some commissions, so that is how she met John. And he taught at the Cleveland Institute. He was the head of the guitar department there for a long time. In 2012, guitarist Alejandro Cote recorded this piece on his album Silhouettes, New American Music for Guitar, as well as a couple other pieces by Larsen. And on her website, this is the reference recording. It's a great recording. So when I first kind of got acquainted to this piece and played this piece a long time ago, back in my undergrad, and then really began to study it, just in the title we have so much information. Sarabande in Profane style. So I started with, okay, well, what's a sarabande? What's the history of the sarabande? It originated as a zarabanda in the 16th century in Central America. And at this point, it is an energetic dance with sung text that is accompanied by guitar and percussion, such as castanets. So then this dance was introduced to Spain by the conquistadors upon the return from the New World, and it became popular there. But then, and this is, I remember I was like kind of shocked when I learned this, in 1583, it was banned. So this energetic dance was a bit erotic in nature, and the Catholic Church and just conservative culture as a whole disapproving of this. So it sort of transformed from this erotic, energetic dance to something that is slower and more stately. It gradually spread to European countries in the 16th and 17th century, such as the Italian states, France, England, and it became a fashionable dance in court. And then we get to the Baroque era, 17th and early 18th century, and I think if you sort of like stop and talk to, a musician in 2024, this is probably the sarabande they associate with most. The sarabande becomes a standard component of the dance suite and instrumental music. So for like a guitarist, Bach's cello suites and lute suites that have been arranged for guitar, standard repertoire for us. And now it's characterized by a slow tempo, triple meter, typically in 3/4, emphasis on the second beat of the measure. The form is typically binary or variation, and it's typically sectional, meaning the sections repeat, for example, AA or BB. So after I kind of dived into that, I dived into the second part of this title, in profane style. Profane, of course, meaning to be irreverent, disrespectful of religion or something of sort of that high authority. So what does this mean? Sarabande, the history we know, in a disrespectful style. That was sort of my jumping point to dive off into this piece. We're going to start with how Larsen either adheres or abandons these typical sarabande conventions and the historical relevance of the sarabande. And P.S., some of them may fall into both categories. So just starting off with the instrumentation, it was written for guitar and for a guitarist. I think this could clearly be nodding to the Sarabande, the fact that it was accompanied by guitar. I think another perhaps connection, but maybe not as direct as the Sarabande, is when we get into the Sarabande, later on in history, that when it becomes part of a dance suite, written for instrumental music. I think that could be a connection as well. You will hear, and I'll play just a little bit in a second of these once we get to a later slide, but you'll hear a lot of percussive techniques that are used on the guitar. And we don't always think about that, of course, because we're like very fortunate as guitarists to have so many strings and you can play so many notes. But there are these percussive techniques that we use as well. Tambora, which translates to drum, golpe, to hit or not, or rasgueado, to strum. And I think this is clearly nodding to the Sarabande Spanish roots of the percussion and the castanets that was used to accompany this energetic dance. So we'll hear a little bit of that in a second. Now in the very beginning of the piece, this is like really the first couple handfuls of measures, we have some text for the performer, and it says, it's probably pretty small to you, slowly, sensually, as if beckoning with subtle, deeply warm movements, slow again with sensuous anticipation. I think this is a clear connection of why it was banned. Of course, we know with history, the erotic nature of the Sarabande, and it kind of transforming into something slow and stately. I think Larsen is sort of taking this and kind of spinning it on its head and giving it to us right away. So let me just play, I won't even sit down fully, a little bit of how that kind of slow, sensual beginning starts. So that's the very beginning of the piece, so when you hear that, know that you're hearing sort of a nod to why it was banned. Next, after this kind of section ends, you're going to hear a new section of the piece, and we have a tempo change, and it says the dance begins. I think this could be nodding to, of course, the Sarabande, it being a dance, this energetic dance, or in later history, when it becomes a standard part of the dance suite. And you know what, let me play that as well. So once you hear this, you'll know the dance begins. That's your indicator that the dance begins. Okay, and on we go. And let me preface with these particularly are the ones that sort of are in a gray area and can sort of fall into both categories. So let's start with meter. We know that the Sarabande is typically in 3/4. So sort of my first kind of look at the piece was like, well, what's the time signatures here? Hint, the time signature changes a lot, which we'll get to in a second, but we do have 4 measures out of the entire piece in 3/4. So she's hinting at it a little bit. I'm not sure if it's consistent to be a full adhering to the Sarabande, but she's hinting at it a little bit. The typical Sarabande rhythm is quarter note, a dotted quarter note, and an 1/8 note. So at the crux of these 2 measures, you can see that it's there, but you can also see that it's varied. You know, we have some bass notes, we have some sort of 16th note runs. So again, this is one that I think adheres to it some, but she's varying it some, so we'll get to that in a second. And then accents. We know that in a Sarabande, typically the second beat is accented, has some, it's emphasized in certain ways. This is another one where it happens sometimes, but it doesn't happen all the time. So, for example, the Sarabande rhythm, it inherently has some emphasis on that second beat. There are other examples where Larsen draws attention to the second beat in creative ways. For instance, this first kind of little section of the meters, she has some fermatas on the second beat there. So, for instance, fermata, fermata. But keep in mind that I don't think this happens consistent enough throughout the piece to say it's fully adhering, so put a pin in that. Next, we know that Sarabandes are typically sectional, which means the sections repeat. This does not happen in the traditional sense in this piece, but this reoccurring motif that happens, this is the motif that starts the very beginning of the piece, the slowly, sensually. It comes back throughout the piece, almost always in the same pitch content, F sharp, D, C sharp, G, and F sharp. There's only one instance that it doesn't, it being the F, D, B natural, G natural. But it comes back throughout the piece. It's varied rhythmically a bit. It has some, sometimes some chords interspersed throughout it. But I think this motif coming back is sort of a creative way to make something feel sectional and have some continuity between the piece. So I think she's adhering to it in a creative way here. And now let's get into abandoning. How is she abandoning some of these conventions? We've talked about meter already. So far we know there's 4 measures of 3/4. This beginning section actually is not metered at all. So this sort of like slow, sensual da 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 da, where that motif comes in, it's not metered at all. And then when we get out of that, when the dance begins, we have measures of 4/4, 5/4, 2/4, 6/8, and 3/4. So while she does have some 3/4, again, I just don't know if it's consistent enough to say she's totally adhering to that convention. She's certainly abandoning it at a lot of times as well. And then just if we're kind of talking tempo-wise, the Sarabande being this energetic dance, the Sarabande being transformed into something slow and stately. Well, we start with something slow. I don't know if it's stately because we're being indicated to play sensually. And then the tempo does pick up at the dance begins and gradually gets kind of more energetic and faster. So for this one, she's like kind of doing it all and doing none of it at the same time, which is really interesting. And then this typical Sarabande rhythm, which we discussed a bit already, while it is there, there is a lot of other, there's bass notes and these 16th notes that are coming. It's there, but it has a lot of other things going on. Same with the 16th note run. So it's there, the crux of it, but like I said, a lot of other things going on. And then the accents. This is just one example where she's writing in accents. As you can see, a sudden burst is what it's indicating on all sorts of beats that are not two. So I think she does the accent on the second beat a bit, but not consistent enough to say she's fully adhering to it. She's certainly abandoning it in some ways. Key area of this piece. Of course, you know, Baroque era, and prior to that, we would expect something to be tonal. This is clearly atonal. We have some centricity moments, I think one might argue, but overall, Larsen is sort of taking the pitch content and making it what she will and doing it atonally. And now I'm going to take a moment to just sit down, and I'd like to just talk about these extended, or not really extended, but articulations and techniques that Larsen uses in this piece. It's a very colorful piece, and I just want to take a moment from the lens of like a guitarist. How do we accomplish this on guitar? So she has a lot of indicators to play ponticello. What does that mean? And how would we accomplish this on the guitar? That means for our right hand, we're going to take it close to the bridge, and we're going to get a bright sound by doing this. We also have some moments that we need a really warm sound. The indicator slowly, sensually, as if beckoning with subtle, deeply warm movements, or darkly. How I accomplish that is to play tasto, which means to play over the fretboard, and you'll get something that sounds like this. Or this chord indicated to play darkly. So those are two, you know, colors of sound that are completely opposite from each other. She uses harmonics in this piece. She uses harmonics that are fretted, so that means we have to put a left-hand finger on the fretboard, count up 12 frets, and we get a harmonic sound like this. These are artificial harmonics. Or we can do open string harmonics, which are natural harmonics that sound like this. She also uses pizzicato, which just means to take sort of the kind of squishy part of your hand, almost as a palm mute, and you get sort of the thumpy sound of the pizzicato. And then let's talk about some of these percussion techniques that I think are so important to this piece because of the Spanish roots it has. The tambura, these are techniques that are very common in classical guitar, but also in flamenco guitar. And the tambura means you're going to take some fingers of your right hand, and you're going to tap on the strings near the bridge of the guitar. So a lot of times flamenco guitarists will do this with their thumb, they'll do this with other fingers. I experimented a lot with this piece, by the way, of what exactly sounds best and every time it occurs. But it sounds something like this. I'll use these two fingers. And then we have golpe, which is also a common flamenco and classical technique, which means to almost, strike the guitar right on the soundboard or even on the bridge with one of your fingers. It could be your thumb. I experimented with this a lot too, or these two fingers. And it's simply, playing percussion right on the soundboard of your guitar. And lastly, also used in flamenco and classical guitar a lot, rasgueados, which simply means to strum. She has a, kind of a more basic rasgueado, might be something like this. Using these fingers in a pattern, there's all sorts of patterns that you can do. She kind of notates to do the rasgueado very freely, expressive in dynamics, as long as you want, as long as you wish, she says. So you'll hear something like this. I know that's a Basquiat. And at this point in the presentation, yes, I'll take this time to play the piece in full. It's about 5 minutes, 5 to 6 minutes, and then I will wrap up with some comments and questions. So I hope you enjoy Libby Larsen's Sarabande in Profane style. further ideas and classroom applications that we can use to sort of spread a piece like this, Libby Larsen's music, and other women composers and composers of minorities. I think the one obvious answer is like if you're a guitar professor or have an advanced high school guitar studio, you of course can introduce this kind of piece to your students. In a music history class, I think this would be an awesome assignment to, maybe you're learning about, the Sarabande and the dance suite, to kind of compare and contrast some of these conventions with your students. In a music theory class, when you introduce, atonality to your students, like in sophomore year maybe, this would be a great piece to do that. And I think even in, a beginning guitar studio or class that like maybe you can, they don't have the chops to play this, or even in a music appreciation class, all the different techniques and timbres, I think this would be a great assignment for students. What do you hear? They don't necessarily need to know exactly, what a ponticello or something like that is. And lastly, encouraging your students, especially women, to compose, and maybe they can write their own sarabande that adheres and abandons some of these conventions. And thank you so much.
While we are running very close to time,
Okay, yeah.
If there is any quick moment for a question or two,
Yeah.
please.
I quickly searched that repertoire for guitar written by Larsen. Firstly, your performance was really inspiring, and I can hear a lot of quality of Larsen's music. Yeah, thank you so much for presenting.
Thank you.
I was wondering, among her guitar repertoire, would you mind sharing why you chose this piece particularly?
Yeah, I can tell a little bit of the history of how I kind of came about this piece. I listened to this piece years ago in my undergrad, and I was doing, I was wanting to play music by people that were not just white men. I hate to say it like it, but it's true. So I was looking for women composers, I was looking for queer composers, and I came across her music. And just over the years, at first I was kind of just playing the piece, and then, just continuing on in my life, and figuring more out about Larsen. I've interviewed her and talked to her, and she's just a very inspiring person. I think this piece just has so much, there's just so much to it. Like, I'm sure in the next 5 years I could do another presentation on this and have more to say. So yeah, I think it's a mix between, I'm just very inspired by Larsen in general, and this particular piece I've sort of had a connection with just throughout the last 10 years. So, other questions? I know we're running.
Well, another